I spent 4 days in North Wales shooting film on my Canon AE-1. I took one roll of Ilford HP5, I took one lens, a 28mm prime, and I had 36 exposures to last me the whole trip. I optimistically sent my film to Southsun to get developed and scanned, and I've just had the scans back. So let me show you what I photographed, and more importantly, tell you how I feel about the photos. So before I talk you through the photos from this trip, I want to provide a few disclaimers to keep in mind as we look through these photos. Firstly, this wasn't a dedicated photography trip, this was a bit of a holiday. It was a getaway for Alex's birthday, and because of that, photography wasn't the priority. Also, I just want you to know that I've done very little editing to these scans. I have adjusted the exposure or corrected the exposure in a few instances and have adjusted the contrast to compensate for the change in exposure. So day one of the trip started in Ilford National Park, and we headed to the Ogwen Valley and decided to go on a bit of a walk up to Cwm Idwal, one of my absolute favourite parts of the national park. The photos from this location were all about trying to capture the drama of that landscape. There was low-hanging cloud, mist that was swirling around the summits of Tryfan and the Gliders. This first shot was a good example of that. I really liked the texture of the slab of rock in the foreground catching that afternoon light. It really helped illuminate the texture and provided a nice bit of contrast against the mountains behind it. And the star of the show was definitely the lone boulder, which I isolated in the composition in the negative space of the sky. This second image is similar, again focusing on the texture and the patterns of the rock. In this shot I really enjoyed the convergence of leading lines. You have the big slab on the left, the dry stone wall that moves its way into the frame from the bottom right, and the flank of Pen yr Olwen on the right hand side leading the eye down the valley. Now I know what you might be saying, why didn't you shoot any colour film? Because especially in this location where you've got that really nice purple heather, it would have been nice to see that colour in the photos. It's a good question, and it leads me on to the reason why I decided to choose Ilford HP5, a black and white film stock, for this trip. And mainly it was because, as I mentioned in the intro, this wasn't a dedicated photography trip, and that meant I wasn't really planning the photography to coincide with things like light and conditions. I knew most of the photography was going to be taking place, in the middle of the afternoon. There was going to be harsh light, potentially unfavourable conditions, and that's not always the best for colour photos, especially when I was conscious of the expense of shooting film as well. I thought shooting in black and white would enable me to make the most of those harsh, light, contrasty conditions, and it just meant that I wasn't plagued by the conditions and I could literally just shoot photos at any time of the day, knowing that the chances are I'd end up with something half decent at the end of it. And without massaging my ego too much, and I need to give myself a little pat on the back for this one, because actually the one thing that you need to know about Ilford National Park is that the weather can change in the blink of an eye. You can get all 4 seasons in one day, and that's definitely what happened as we were leaving Cwm Idwal. We decided to head back down to the Ogwen Valley just as a big weather system was coming in, and I managed to get this photo looking down the Nant Francon Valley. This is a technically horrific photo for many reasons. I was stood on an exposed ledge with the wind and rain blowing directly into the camera. I probably should have stopped down the aperture and increased the shutter speed because the image is a little soft on reflection. But I think that only really adds to the atmosphere and the drama, and that's what I was trying to capture in this particular photo. It's one of my favourite photos, and I think it's such a compelling representation of what I think of when I think of Ilford National Park. It's all about the mood, the drama, and of course, the atmosphere. We concluded that first day by visiting Penmon Point, which is in the southeast corner of the island of Anglesey, which wasn't too far from where we were staying. And I thought this would be a location that would warrant a few frames in black and white, because the lighthouse with its contrasty black and white stripes just looks so great. We spent a little bit of time just exploring the rock pools and the beach, and I managed to capture this photo of this man fishing. In this photo I like the balance between the lighter tones and the darker tones. I feel like there's not one tonality that is overpowering this particular composition, and I also like that the fisherman is silhouetted against the background. For me, it just evokes a sense of curiosity because you can't really distinguish his features. What struck me when I first received these scans and I was looking through the photos was how few photos I actually remember taking. You have to keep in mind that these photos were only taken 3 weeks ago, and I don't think my memory is that bad. I spoke a little bit about this topic on this week's podcast episode. If you haven't listened to my podcast, The Caffeinated Camera Club, I'll leave a link down in the description. With digital photos, we get that instant feedback. Even when we're out in the field, we immediately review our images. We maybe start critiquing those images, and then we take another photo because we want to finesse something. And then we get home, we back up the images. Maybe if we're really excited about a photo, we just start editing it straight away. And that's fine, don't get me wrong, but we become very familiar with our photos very, very quickly. And that's just not something that is possible with film. And that familiarity can sometimes plague our opinion of the photos that we take. With these photos, I spent maybe a couple of minutes just composing the scene, and then I spent 1/250th of a second taking the image. And that's it. It's over at that point. There's no way to review it, and then you're just on to the next photo. It's just out of sight and out of mind, and that lack of familiarity means that when you eventually get the scans back of those images, every single photo feels brand new. And I think that is such a lovely thing. It really shows the value of delayed gratification in photography. These photos are a good example of that. These were photographed on Llanddwyn Island. We were a couple of hours before sunset and the light was looking really beautiful. I remember watching the light catching the contours and undulations of the dunes and the marram grass, and this is definitely a photo about the light and about texture as opposed to it being about one particular subject. And this shot in the opposite direction looking towards the mountains of Areval on the Llyn Peninsula is again a similar exploration, just with a few different elements in the frame, and I really like both of these images. I think it's worth mentioning at this point that whilst some of these images are a little abstract, I have been really impressed with the 28mm f2.8 prime that I was using. At around f8 and f11, which is typically the aperture I was using for most of the photos in this gallery, I was just really impressed with the level of sharpness and detail that I was able to capture with this lens. And that lens choice was another really great part of this creative process. I don't own a 28mm prime on my digital mirrorless system, but over the years I have learned about my own photography that I do favour shooting at wider focal lengths. I used to love shooting around 50mm, and as time has gone on, I enjoy the challenge of trying to compose things at a wider focal length, and I like to introduce a little bit more of the wider context of the scene into my photos. So nowadays, I guess I'm shooting anywhere from like maybe 24mm to 35mm as kind of like my sweet spot. One of the main benefits of shooting a focal length that you're not typically accustomed to is that it does provide a slightly more unique perspective, which can make you feel a little bit more excited about the creative process. But also just having that limitation in focal length, I found for this particular trip, just meant that I was spending far less time labouring over, my compositions. It's not like I could change lenses, it's not like I could zoom with a zoom lens to alter the perspective. I was very much just leaning into the perspective that the lens provided. And I really enjoyed that experience. These final images were shot in the village of Trevor on the Llyn Peninsula. I think shooting film, and especially black and white film, really made these scenes shine. This old scrapyard with the 80s or 90s VW Golf, might have been a Polo, I'm not sure. It just really speaks to that idea of a bygone era. And I think that nostalgia of black and white film just really suited this scene perfectly. Likewise here with this old quad bike being consumed by the weeds and ivy, the backdrop of the garage with its weathered facade provided just so much great texture. These photos are definitely some of my absolute favourites. And maybe it's surprising that on a photography trip into North Wales, a place with beautiful landscapes, that some of my favourite images were of these more quieter, normal, everyday sorts of scenes. So what has shooting film and what have I learned from this process and what have I learned about the images that I've taken? Well, firstly, it's taught me that I definitely need to spend more time shooting film because there's nothing about the process of shooting film that I don't enjoy, aside from maybe the cost. But I think the benefits far outweigh the cost in a lot of instances. But I think in terms of a practical photographic or photography lesson, what this exercise has taught me is the importance of treating each image individually. I remember when I was taking some of these photos, at the time I was so excited about what I was photographing. It was pretty much all I could think about. And I think that definitely overshadowed some of these forgotten frames, as I like to call them. These photos on the roll that I didn't really pay any attention to and that I wasn't really expecting to see. They were the photos that I'd literally forgotten all about. Looking at these photos now 3 weeks later, I don't think I was wrong to feel excited about those photos. Don't get me wrong, I think on any given photo trip, we are always going to come home with certain scenes and certain photos that we're more excited about than others. But when shooting digitally, I think we can become so consumed by our favourite photos that we often back up our images, import everything into Lightroom, and then we concentrate so much time on those keeper images. And maybe those other photos, those quieter photos, just fall into the background. They're in the depths of, our archives on Lightroom or, on a SD card somewhere. And because of the way that we shoot digitally, we're always on to the next shoot, the next location, and sometimes we forget to look back. The beauty of this exercise, reviewing these photos for the first time 3 weeks later, is that it removes that knee-jerk reaction that you get when you are immediately reviewing your photos and becoming so familiar with your photos, like I mentioned earlier in this video. Removing that knee-jerk reaction just means that you are able to really assess the merit and the value of each individual photo. And I think that's something that I'm going to try and keep in mind moving forward, not just, with this particular film camera, but with my Lumix S5 II as well. I do want to give photos room to breathe, and I want to give them a chance to, I guess, just reach their full potential. It's just that idea of letting the dust settle, and I think time is the only thing that can allow that to happen. So I will wrap up the video here. Let me know what photos were your favourite, and let me know if you've been enjoying shooting film this summer. If you haven't tried it, I definitely think that you should. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. Give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and if you're new around here and you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, I would love it if you could just take a second to hit the subscribe button. As always, guys, love to hear from you in the comments. See you next week.